A racist white police officer, for no reason at all, humiliated a black boy in public, and he did it with pleasure. The entire store was silent, looks of contempt and judgment weighing on the boy, as if he were guilty for the simple fact of existing. "What are you doing here, kid? Did you think no one would notice you were stealing?" The police officer's voice echoed through the Oakland supermarket, and the sound of bags being ripped, shelves shaking, seemed to amplify the injustice that was happening there, right in front of everyone. The boy, confused, tried to speak, tried to explain that he was just shopping, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But his words fell into emptiness, swallowed by the policeman's arrogance and cold eyes. He was forced to empty his pockets in front of everyone, while customers whispered and judged. The police officer looked at him with an ironic smile, the kind of smile of someone who knew he had power and was willing to use every ounce of it to destroy a defenseless person. The policeman continued, mercilessly, "Do you see this? It's about learning that people like you have no place here. You think you can do whatever you want just because you're a kid? I know the type you are. I know exactly what you are." Every word was like a blow, every look was an accusation, and the boy had no escape. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, as if he were trapped in a trap he did nothing to deserve. That public humiliation, that scene of shame that the police officer created just because he could, just because he was different, just because he was black. Everyone stood still, no one did anything. No one even blinked as the police officer held him by the arm, rummaging through his things, looking for any excuse to justify his anger and prejudice. And the boy just wanted to disappear. Every fiber of his being begged for him to be swallowed by the ground, for this shame to end, for this moment to pass quickly like a nightmare. But no, the policeman continued, "You're just a dirty little thief, and I'm going to teach you a lesson today. I'm going to teach you that people like you don't have a chance." The words pierced the soul, and every second felt like an eternity. Everyone's eyes in the store were on him, and no one knew that this boy wasn't just any other boy. Nobody knew who he really was. Because the police officer, full of himself and the certainty that he was doing the right thing, had no idea that that boy was the son of someone powerful. Someone who wouldn't let that go. Someone who would take justice not with his own hands, but with the power of truth, knowledge and influence. What no one knew was that that boy's father was one of the CIA's most respected agents, someone who dedicated his life to protecting people, defending the country, and who would never accept that his son went through such a degrading and unfair situation. From that moment on, when the policeman pushed him, when he called him a thief, when he thought he had won the battle, the real fight was just beginning. And when his father found out what happened, his world changed. It wasn't just about revenge, it wasn't just about justice, it was about destroying that feeling of superiority that people like that police officer carried with them, thinking they could humiliate, thinking they could hurt. Revolt burned in his father's eyes, and he decided that he would not rest until he saw that police officer pay for every word he spoke, every humiliation he used like a weapon. He knew he needed to act quickly, but he also knew he needed to be smart. It was time to turn the tables, to show that this is not just a physical confrontation, but a battle for dignity and respect. Days passed, but the police officer remained safe, certain that nothing would happen. He went back to his routine, acting as if the incident had been just another day at work. For him, the boy was just another name on the list of suspects, someone who would never have a chance. But he was about to discover that the consequences of his actions would go far beyond what he could imagine. The boy's father, with his CIA training and skills, knew exactly how to gather evidence, how to take a person down from the inside out, without having to raise his voice. He began to plan a precise strike, something that would not only punish the police officer, but make him feel the weight of every word, every humiliation, every moment of abuse of power. And when the policeman least expected it, his world would fall apart. But the question that remained was, how? How can a parent fight a system that constantly protects those it oppresses? How could he ensure that justice was served without his son being further exposed, without that pain being relived all over again? And most importantly, What would he do when he found out about all the dirt the police officer was hiding? The answer to these questions is hidden in every detail of this story, in every careful step the boy's father took to turn the tide. This is a story of revenge, justice, and courage. A story that goes beyond simple humiliation, shows how, even in the darkest moments, it is still possible to make a difference. Brace yourself, because this story is just beginning, and what this boy's father did shocked everyone. Want to know how this battle of justice ended? Stay with us until the end of this story, because what's to come will surprise you. Before we start the story, we want to leave an important message for all our listeners, especially for you. Perhaps you have already experienced a similar situation or know someone who has gone through something like this. Note plow of twist, we do not support any type of racism or discrimination. Here, we believe in equality and respect for everyone, which is why we create stories that reflect this struggle and show the importance of justice and empathy. We hope this narrative inspires and empowers you. We wish you a great story, and if you're not yet subscribed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Now, let's get to the story. Oakland was a vibrant city, full of life but also marked by contrasts. There were neighborhoods that buzzed with culture, where families had known each other for decades, and others where tension mixed with a sense of injustice, creating a fine line between hope and revolt. And it was in this scenario that Marlon grew up. A 18-year-old boy, athletic, curious and with an ambition that went beyond what his eyes could see. Marlon had a presence that did not go unnoticed, always carrying a determined look, but also a kindness and intelligence that made him stand out among his friends and teachers. Marlon was an only child and lived with his father, Curtis, and grandmother. The absence of his mother, who died when he was just 2 years old, created an even stronger bond between him and Curtis. Their relationship was deep, based on mutual respect and lots of love. Curtis was a strong, respected man, and contrary to what many thought, he was not just another working man trying to survive. He had a secret that few knew. He was a senior CIA agent, specializing in intelligence operations. He had dedicated his life to serving the country, going on several missions around the world, always keeping a low profile, but effective. In fact, even Marlon knew little about what his father did exactly, just enough to understand that it was something serious, dangerous, and very important. Curtis wanted his son to have a normal life, away from any undue attention. Therefore, Marlon grew up without showing off luxury, always receiving a strict but loving education. His father made a point of teaching principles of honesty and justice. Curtis' concern has always been to ensure that Marlon grows with opportunities, but also with humility and respect for others. And despite having all the resources to live in a more privileged neighborhood, Curtis decided to remain in Oakland, the city he loved, and where Marlon always knew he belonged. The neighborhood where they lived was a mixture of different cultures and social classes. A place where your next-door neighbor could be an honest worker or someone who was fighting to stop crime. This made Marlon a resilient boy, used to dealing with different realities. He was popular among his friends, passionate about basketball and full of dreams. Everyone who knew him knew he had immense potential, but they also knew he needed luck, as the world wasn't usually kind to boys like him. Curtis knew this too. Every conversation he had with his son, every piece of advice given, was an attempt to prepare him for the challenges he knew were coming. He always looked Marlon in the eyes and said, "Remember who you are. Never let anyone make you feel smaller. The world may try to knock you down, but you will always get up. Always." And Marlon listened. He wanted to be strong like his father. I wanted to show the world that he could go beyond stereotypes, that he wasn't just another number, another face in the crowd. It was on a Saturday morning, while Marlon was out shopping for his grandmother, that he found himself in the eye of a hurricane that would change everything. The local grocery store was one of those places everyone knew. It was the heart of the neighborhood, where families did their weekly shopping and children ran through the aisles with shopping carts. Marlon was just doing what he always did, picking up basic items, talking to people he knew, until something caught his attention. A white police officer, who Marlon recognized as someone who was in the area frequently, was looking at him strangely. A look that Marlon already knew too well, that look of judgment, of someone who didn't see him as a person, but as a threat. The police officer was called Mike Donovan, and he was known for his toughness, but also for something that people avoided talking about, his racism. Donovan had been transferred to Oakland a few months ago, but was already causing discomfort in the community. He was a hardline cop, a man who believed the only way to maintain order was to impose fear. For him, young black men like Marlon were always suspects. It didn't matter the context, it didn't matter the situation. In his mind, people like that were walking problems. Donovan had a simple view of the world, a world where he was the hero and where everyone else was a suspect until proven otherwise. Donovan watched Marlon as he walked through the supermarket aisles. His face hardened, his eyes followed the boy's every move, until he decided to act. Without hesitation, he approached Marlon, with an aggressive stance and his hand resting on the gun. He didn't just want to approach the boy, I wanted to show power, I wanted everyone in the market to see who was in charge. "You there," Donovan said, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "What are you doing? Are you going to tell me you didn't come to steal anything? Show what's in your pockets." The atmosphere of the supermarket changed in an instant. Customers looked at the boy, some with surprise, others already judging. Marlon tried to remain calm. He was scared, of course, but he didn't want to let it show. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that for people like Donovan, it didn't matter. "I didn't do anything," Marlon replied, his voice trying to sound firm, but shaking slightly. "I'm just shopping. I didn't do anything." But Donovan wasn't listening. He had already decided that Marlon was guilty. It was as if this was a show and he had to give the performance of his life. He grabbed Marlon's arm tightly, pushed him against a shelf and started taking everything out of his pockets, keys, wallet, some coins, an old phone. Nothing that would even look suspicious, but Donovan didn't want to see it. He wanted to destroy. "I wanted to humiliate." It's always like that, right? Always the same story. You think you can do whatever you want, but not with me around. Not while I'm here to bring order to this city. The words were filled with hate, filled with a fury that seemed to have no end. Donovan rolled his eyes at Marlon, while the customers around him watched in silence, not knowing how to act or what to say. At that moment, Marlon wanted to disappear. He wanted to run, he wanted to hide, he wanted this to be just a bad dream. But it was real, so real that he could feel Donovan's look of contempt like knives cutting into his skin. The silence was heavy, and every second seemed like an eternity. That humiliation, that despair he felt was like a fire burning inside, a flame he knew he would never be able to put out. And meanwhile, somewhere in the city, Curtis still didn't know what had happened. He didn't know that, at that exact moment, his son was facing the worst kind of injustice. But he would find out. And when that happened, the entire city would feel the weight of their reaction. That incident at the supermarket was etched in Marlon's memory. The days passed, but the feeling of humiliation and injustice never left his mind. He tried to focus on school, on basketball lessons, but everything seemed pointless. When he got home, he did everything he could to hide how he felt. He didn't want to worry his father, Curtis, who was always busy with work. But something changed in him that day. Marlon felt that, no matter how hard he tried, the world would always see him as someone who didn't deserve to be there, someone to be discredited and reduced to stereotypes. Curtis noticed. He knew his son better than anyone and knew something was wrong. Marlon's behavior was different, he was quieter, more introspective. That night, while Marlon was in the room, Curtis approached and knocked lightly on the door. "Hey, can I come in?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Marlon nodded, and Curtis sat down next to him. For a moment, the father just looked at his son, saying nothing, trying to understand what was happening. Until, in a soft voice, he said, "Marlon, I know you. I know something happened. And I want you to know that, whatever it is, you don't have to go through this alone. Curtis's words broke something inside Marlon. All the mask of strength he was trying to maintain came crashing down, and he spilled the beans. The approach at the supermarket, the police officer's words, the humiliation he suffered in front of everyone. He tried not to cry, but the tears came like a flood, each word filled with anger, sadness and fear. Curtis listened to every detail with a steady gaze, but his heart was on fire. He felt his son's every word as if they were blades cutting into his soul. He knew the world was unfair, but he never imagined he would see his own son go through that. When Marlon finished speaking, Curtis hugged him tightly, saying nothing for a long time, just letting his son feel that he was there. "It won't stay like this," Curtis whispered, holding Marlon by the shoulders and looking straight into his eyes. "I promise you, son. It won't stay like this." That promise from Curtis meant a lot. But he knew he couldn't act like a father, he needed to act like the trained agent he was. His mind was filled with strategies, thinking about how he could take down that racist police officer. He wouldn't just resolve the situation. He would make sure Donovan paid the price for what he did, that he would never repeat that behavior to another boy. The next day, Curtis began to act. He made discreet calls, talked to CIA acquaintances, gathered information about Mike Donovan. And with each new discovery, Curtis' anger and determination only increased. Donovan had a history of abuse and racism. In his former assignment, in another city, there had been several reports of aggressive behavior, but they were all archived. Donovan knew how to navigate the system to get away with it, and Curtis knew he had to be smart to catch him. While Curtis hatched his plan, Marlon tried to move on with his life. But the incident haunted him like a shadow. His friends knew something was wrong, but he didn't want to talk about what happened. The only person he finally opened up to was Nina, his best friend. A free-spirited girl, always ready to defend others, Nina listened carefully to Marlon, and upon learning what happened, her reaction was immediate. "It can't stay like this, Marlon. This guy can't go around doing whatever he wants. We have to do something." Marlon just shook his head. "I know, Nina. I know. But what can I do? I'm just a boy. And he's the cop." But Nina didn't accept that answer. "You're not just a boy, Marlon. You have a voice, you have strength. And I'm with you. We can do something together." These words brought a little hope to Marlon, but he didn't know how to act. The idea of standing up to a police officer seemed impossible, and the shame he felt that day was still so fresh that he could barely think about it without his stomach turning. Meanwhile, Curtis worked quietly, gathering evidence, connecting the dots of a web of abuse that Donovan had left behind in his career. He knew he could only act once, that he would only have one chance to unmask the police officer and ensure he was punished. Every call he made, every document he reviewed, was a step closer to justice. A few weeks later, Curtis was ready for the next step. He knew he needed to expose Donovan publicly, make his actions known to everyone, and make the social and legal pressure unrelenting. He gathered the necessary evidence and planned the right time to act, but there was one thing he still needed to do: tell Marlon. That night, Curtis called his son for a serious talk. Marlon was nervous. He knew his father was working on something, but he had no idea what it was. "Son," Curtis began, his voice firm. "I promised it wouldn't stay like this, and I will keep my promise. But I need you to trust me. I will make this man pay for what he did. But you need to be prepared. This will not be easy, and we may face a lot of resistance." Marlon nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and hope. He always knew his father was a strong man, but he never saw him like that, so determined, so willing to do anything for his son. For the first time since the incident, Marlon felt like maybe, just maybe, he could come out of this situation stronger. But there were still doubts. What if they failed? What if Donovan managed to escape once again? Meanwhile, Donovan continued his routine, unaware that he was the target of a secret investigation. For him, life was the same as always, daily patrols, an aggressive approach here, an abuse of power there. And he liked that. He liked having control, being responsible for, putting order, in places like Oakland, without knowing that Marlon's father was about to do something that would change his life forever. The tension increased every day. Curtis knew that the right moment was approaching, and Marlon, even without understanding all the details, felt that something big was coming. It was like a storm brewing on the horizon, threatening to change everything, and they were right in the eye of that storm. And so, with feelings on the surface, injustice still pulsing like an open wound, and a promise of justice about to be fulfilled, all paths converged towards a single moment. A moment that would not only be about justice, but about revenge, courage and the breaking of a system that has always tried to keep Marlon and so many others silent. But the question that remained in the air was, how would Curtis make Donovan pay? How would he turn his son's pain into real justice? And what would happen when the truth finally came out? Everything was about to change. And the change would not be subtle. On that cold October morning, the Oakland sky was gray, as if the city was about to witness something that would change its course. Curtis, after weeks of meticulous investigation, felt that the time to act had finally arrived. He had everything he needed on hand, documents, recordings and statements from previous victims, all proving a clear pattern of abuse of authority and racism by Mike Donovan. Every detail was carefully organized. Donovan would have nowhere to run. Curtis had prepared for that day as if it were a mission, one of those he was used to doing in his work at the CIA. The plan was simple but effective. He needed to catch Donovan by surprise, confront him publicly, so that the truth could no longer be hidden. And the perfect opportunity for this would be the community safety event that would take place that afternoon, organized by the City Hall. Donovan would be there, as a representative of the local police, speaking about protection and justice, ironically, values that he himself had betrayed. Meanwhile, Marlon was a nervous wreck. He knew his father was up to something big, but he had no idea what was really coming. Curtis didn't tell him all the details, just enough for him to understand that that day would be a turning point. At that moment, Marlon didn't know whether to feel fear or hope. Fear that everything would go wrong, hope that he could finally see justice done. Nina, as always, was by his side, trying to reassure him. "Everything will be fine, Marlon," she said, holding his hand tightly. "I know it will. Your father knows what he's doing. And you deserve that justice to be served." Marlon just nodded, trying to believe it. He wanted to believe, but the shadow of what had happened still hung over him, constantly reminding him of how cruel the world could be. That day, the event at City Hall was packed. There were people from all over the community, local leaders, activists, residents who wanted to hear what the police had to say about safety. And there, in the spotlight, was Mike Donovan. Wearing his uniform, he looked relaxed, with that arrogant smile that Marlon knew so well. Donovan was in the spotlight, ready to give his speech, ready to once again play the role of exemplary police officer. Curtis and Marlon arrived together, positioning themselves at the back of the room, watching every movement. As Donovan began to speak, Curtis felt the tension in his shoulders increase, as if the officer's every word was a reminder of what he had done to his son. Donovan's speech began in typical fashion, talking about how the police were committed to the well-being of the community and working to protect all citizens. Marlon clenched his fists tightly, barely able to contain his anger. The officer's hypocrisy was too much for him. "He's lying to everyone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's lying and nobody knows what he did." "They will know," Curtis replied, his eyes fixed on the stage. "Everyone will know." And it was then that Curtis got up and started walking towards the stage, with firm and determined steps. The room fell silent as he advanced, and Donovan, who until then had spoken confidently, seemed disconcerted to see Curtis approach. The officer clearly hadn't expected that interruption, much less from someone he didn't immediately recognize. "Excuse me, sir," Curtis began, his voice calm but full of determination. "I have something to say about the safety of this community. Something I believe everyone here needs to hear." Donovan tried to maintain his composure. "Sir, this is no time for interruptions. If you have something to say, you can wait until the end." But Curtis didn't move. He took a flash drive out of his pocket and held it aloft. "I have evidence of a pattern of police abuse. Evidence that the person who is here, on this stage, talking about justice and protection, is nothing more than an aggressor, a racist who uses his uniform to humiliate and hurt innocent people." Donovan tried to interrupt him, his voice now thick with irritation. "What do you think you are doing? This is a serious accusation, and you have no right," but Curtis ignored him. He handed the flash drive to one of the event organizers and asked for the content to be played on the screen for everyone to see. Meanwhile, Donovan tried in vain to stop the video from airing. "Turn it off. This is absurd. I am a respectful police officer." But it was too late. The images began to play on the screen, and the entire hall was in shock. They were recordings of Donovan's previous approaches. Abuses of authority, racist words, acts of aggression against young black people. People in the audience recognized their own stories, their own experiences. Marlon felt a lump in his throat as he saw the images of Donovan forcing other boys like him to go through the same humiliation. And then came the moment he would never forget, the recording of the supermarket incident. Donovan's words echoing through the room, the image of Marlon being forced to empty his pockets, it was all there, in front of everyone. The silence was broken by murmurs of outrage. People stood up, in disbelief at what they saw. Donovan desperately tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by shouts of outrage. "You lied to us," a woman shouted from the audience. "You abused your power." Curtis then turned to Donovan, facing him head-on. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted, and no one would ever stop you. But your end has come, Donovan. You won't hurt anyone again. You won't hide behind that badge anymore." Donovan, now sweating and desperate, tried to defend himself. "This is a scam. These images were manipulated. Don't believe this man. He just wants to end my career." But no one was willing to listen to his excuses. Community leaders began to rise up and demand an immediate investigation. Chaos took over the event. Marlon, who until then was in the background, was taken to the stage by Curtis. He faced Donovan, the same police officer who had humiliated him weeks before, but now the situation was different. This time, he wasn't the helpless victim. He was living proof that Donovan was a criminal. "You won't hurt anyone again," Marlon said, with a firm voice and direct gaze. "You will no longer destroy the lives of boys like me." Donovan, not knowing what to do, tried to flee the stage, but was immediately restrained by other police officers present at the event, who now looked at him with contempt. Curtis made a point of recording every moment with his cell phone, so there would be no doubt about what was happening. "You will pay for every racist act you committed, for every abuse you hid," Curtis spoke, looking directly into Donovan's eyes as he was handcuffed and led away. "This is the beginning of the end for you." And as Donovan was led out of the room, the sound of people cheering and shouting for justice echoed throughout the room. Marlon turned to his father, his eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. For the first time since the incident, he felt that justice was being served, that the humiliation he experienced would not be forgotten, and that Donovan would finally answer for his actions. And so, with Donovan's arrest, the storm brewing over Oakland finally broke, bringing with it a cry for justice that had long been contained. But the battle was not yet completely won. Donovan would still have to answer legally for everything he did, and Curtis knew this would be a new stage. What no one knew was that that event would just be the beginning of a series of revelations and twists that would lead the entire community to come together like never before. Justice, after all, had begun to be served, but what came next would be even more impactful. The event at City Hall had ended in controlled chaos, but that moment was just the beginning of a cascade of events that would put into question not only Mike Donovan's career, but also the power structures that had protected him for so long. Curtis knew the next step would be decisive, and as the community reorganized, still in shock from the revelations, the real battle was about to begin. Shortly after the event, Marlon, Curtis, and Nina returned home, still processing everything that had happened. Marlon was in a mixture of relief and tension. The relief of seeing Donovan finally being held to account for what he did. But also the tension of knowing that the story wouldn't end there, that Donovan's public arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, Marlon finally spoke, as they sat at the kitchen table. And now? Will this be enough? Will he really be arrested? Or is he going to leave and keep doing what he's always done? Curtis, looking firmly at his son, replied, "He's not going to escape this time, Marlon. We managed to expose him publicly, and that is something that no one can ignore anymore. But, things are still going to get complicated. You need to be prepared for what's coming." Marlon shook his head, trying to process his father's words. He knew Curtis was right, but there was something inside him that he couldn't quite believe. After going through so much humiliation, it was difficult to believe that justice would really be served. Nina, who had become a pillar of support for Marlon, interrupted the silence. "Look, Marlon," she began, trying to bring some cheer to her friend. "I know it's hard to believe, but what you did today was huge. You destroyed this police officer's mask. I've never been so proud of you." Marlon looked at Nina, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "I just hope this actually means something. That makes a difference, you know. Because I'm tired, Nina. Tired of being treated like nothing. Tired of having to fight to prove that I'm someone." Nina held Marlon's hand, looking at him intensely. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You are someone. And everyone who knows you knows that. Don't let anyone make you forget that, okay?" Curtis, watching the two's interaction, took a deep breath. He knew this fight was more than personal, it was about ensuring that boys like Marlon could live without fear, without distrust. He knew that to get there, they would need to keep fighting. The following days were crazy. The story of Donovan's arrest spread quickly, being widely covered in local news. Footage of the town hall event was shared on social media, and people from different parts of the country began reacting, voicing their support for Marlon in the Oakland community. The case soon gained national attention, and the pressure on the local police increased every day. There were cries of protest calling for not only Donovan's punishment but also a complete overhaul of police procedures. Meanwhile, Donovan was detained, but not silent. He used all his time to build his own defense, denying all the accusations and placing himself as the victim of a witch hunt. He claimed that Curtis had fabricated evidence, that the entire town hall event was a trap to destroy his career. And even though much of the community was on Marlon's side, there was a small portion of people who supported Donovan, believing his narrative that he was being wrongfully accused. Curtis knew it was only a matter of time before everything was brought to court, and he was ready to fight that battle. But there was something he needed to resolve first. Something Marlon needed to face, something they both needed to confront together. One quiet night, Curtis called Marlon for a more serious conversation. "Son, I need you to understand something. We will have to testify in court. You will have to tell your story, every detail, in front of judges, lawyers, and also in front of Donovan. I know this won't be easy, but it's necessary." Marlon swallowed. The idea of coming face to face with Donovan again, of reliving that moment when he was humiliated, terrified him. "Dad, what if I don't make it? What if I get stuck? If he looks at me like that again and I can't speak?" Curtis approached his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You will make it. Because you are strong, Marlon. Stronger than you imagine. And I will be there, all the time. You won't be alone. Marlon nodded, trying to absorb that strength from his father, trying to believe that he would be able to do what was necessary. Silence hovered for a few moments, until Curtis spoke again, in a softer tone, almost as if he were talking to himself. When I was younger, I also faced a lot, Marlon. Things I didn't want to tell you, because I wanted you to grow up without that weight. But I think it's time you knew. I was a target of racism when I was young, just like you. The difference is that I had no one to fight for me, no one who could help me. I had to bear everything alone. And that's why I joined the CIA. I wanted to change the system from within. But I never thought that one day, this fight would become so personal, that I would have to fight for my own son. Marlon listened in silence, and those words opened his eyes to his father's reality. For the first time, he realized that Curtis's fight wasn't just for justice, it was a fight he carried within himself, a fight that came from years of pain and resistance. And that gave Marlon the strength he needed. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all the generations that came before him, for all who suffered in silence. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, with people from across the Oakland community in attendance to support Marlon and his father. Curtis was next to his son, the two of them holding hands, feeling the weight of that moment. Donovan entered the courtroom with a hard look, accompanied by his lawyer. The final confrontation was about to take place. The judge asked for silence, and the hearing began. Marlon felt his heart accelerate when he was called to testify. He knew that moment would be decisive. He stood up and walked to the pulpit, taking a deep breath. Donovan was staring at him from across the room, with the same look he had in the supermarket, disdainful, arrogant, as if he believed he still had control. "Tell me, Marlon," began the prosecuting attorney. "Can you tell the court, in your own words, what happened that day at the supermarket?" Marlon closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out all the voices around him. He opened his eyes again and began to speak. His voice was firm but full of emotion. He told everything. Every detail. Every word Donovan said, every action he took. As he spoke, he didn't look at Donovan, he looked at the judge, at the jury, at everyone who was there to listen to him. And as the words came out, he felt like a huge weight was being lifted off his shoulders. He was finally being heard. The defense lawyer tried to interrupt him several times, citing inconsistencies, trying to discredit Marlon's testimony. "Mr. Donovan has always served the community with integrity," said the lawyer. "There is no reason to believe he would act so hostile." "Marlon, are you sure there was no misunderstanding?" Marlon looked directly at the defense lawyer, his voice full of certainty. "I'm sure. He humiliated me because he thought I was just another black kid, someone he could treat like dirt. There was no misunderstanding. I know what happened. And you know it too." The room was silent for a few seconds, until the lawyer retreated, without another word. Marlon's strength and honesty had disconcerted even the most experienced lawyer. Curtis looked at his son with pride, seeing that he had finally found his voice, that he was standing up, fighting for what was right. That's exactly what Curtis always wanted for him to have the courage to face his fears, to fight for what he believed in. As the hearing continued, Curtis knew the battle wasn't over yet. But for a moment, he allowed himself to feel a small victory. They had come this far, together. And whatever the end result, Marlon would never be the same. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Marlon had concluded his testimony, and his words echoed through the room, leaving the air heavy with emotions and truths that no one could ignore. Every look, every movement of those present, seemed to be loaded with the weight of what was at stake. Donovan, who until that moment had tried to maintain a confident expression, now showed signs of nervousness. He knew the battle was being lost. The community's reaction, the pressure from the prosecution lawyers, and, most importantly, the courage with which Marlon had told his story, placed him in a position he never expected to be in, the position of someone who finally had to answer. But the hearing was far from over. Donovan's defense still had tricks up its sleeve, and they weren't going to let the officer go down without a desperate fight. After Marlon's testimony, Donovan's lawyer stood up and, in a desperate move to discredit the boy and Curtis, brought up Curtis's history as a CIA agent. He argued that Curtis, with his experience in intelligence and manipulation strategies, could have easily fabricated evidence against Donovan. "You are hearing the testimony of a boy who was clearly trained for this," said the defense lawyer, trying to instill doubt in the jurors. "A boy whose father is an agent trained to manipulate information. How can we be sure this isn't just a well-orchestrated plot to destroy an honest police officer's career?" Those words fell like a bucket of cold water on the court. The direct attack on Curtis's integrity caused him to rise, but the prosecuting attorney restrained him, whispering, "Calm down, Curtis. We're going to win this battle on logic and truth, not emotion." Curtis took a deep breath, but it was difficult to maintain control. That lawyer was using his career to try to justify the unjustifiable, as if the fight for justice for his son was part of a personal revenge plan. As the defense attorney continued his speech, trying to convince the jurors that Donovan was the victim of a larger scheme, Marlon felt the weight of those words. Being the son of someone as powerful as Curtis had always brought him pride, but in that moment he felt the injustice of seeing his father accused of something that was the exact opposite of what he had always stood for. Everything Curtis did was to protect his son, and now he was being attacked for it. When the defense finally finished his speech, murmurs began to spread throughout the room. The jurors exchanged glances, and the pressure increased. But then something unexpected happened. A woman stood up in the crowd, with a determined expression. She was a discreet figure until then, but everyone recognized her voice as soon as she spoke. "My name is Sandra Johnson. And I am one of this officer's victims." Everyone turned toward the voice, and Donovan turned visibly pale. He knew who Sandra was. She was one of the people who tried to prosecute him years ago for abuse of authority, but her case was buried due to lack of evidence. And now she was there, bringing her testimony to light, willing to speak again. The defense lawyer tried to block her testimony, arguing that she was not on the witness list, but the judge allowed Sandra to speak. She told her story in a firm voice, recounting how Donovan humiliated her, how he treated her with contempt and racism while she was just driving home. "I tried to speak at the time," Sandra said, her voice getting more intense, "but no one listened. No one wanted to believe a black woman against the word of a police officer. But now, with everything that has been revealed here, I refuse to remain silent." Those words brought a new wave of emotions to the court. Other people, who were also victims of Donovan, began to speak out. Shouts of justice and support from Marlon echoed through the room, as the defense became increasingly unable to contain the situation. Curtis looked at Marlon, and the boy realized that it was much bigger than him. It was a battle for everyone who was silenced. The judge, realizing the direction the case was taking, called a break so the jury could deliberate on the new testimony. At that moment, Curtis and Marlon sat side by side in the court waiting room as they waited for their next move. The silence between them was heavy, but full of complicity. Father and son connected in a way they perhaps never had before. That was the moment of union, where all the suffering and struggle made sense. "Okay," Marlon broke the silence. Thank you. I never would have been able to do this alone." Curtis smiled, a small smile, but full of pride. "You're not alone, son. You never were. And you never will be. That's always been my goal. To fight for you, so that you never feel alone, so that you're never silent." While they awaited the jury's deliberation, news about Donovan's case was already on TV. The press was covering every detail, and the Oakland community was torn between outrage and hope. Curtis knew this was one of those defining moments that could change everything, not just for them, but for all the victims of the flawed system that Donovan represented. Finally, the hearing resumed. Everyone returned to the courtroom, and the atmosphere was one of absolute tension. Marlon felt his heart pounding, every second felt like an eternity. Donovan, now sitting silently, had lost any semblance of confidence. He knew that the defense was crumbling and that the chances of getting away with it were getting smaller by the minute. The prosecution lawyer, taking advantage of the spontaneous testimony of Sandra and the other victims, began to put together an irrefutable narrative line. He didn't just attack Donovan as a racist individual, but raised a discussion about systemic abuse, about how police officers like him felt authorized to act above the law, believing they would never face consequences. "This case," said the lawyer, looking firmly at the jurors, "it's not just about Marlon and Donovan. It's about a system that fails to protect its citizens, that allows certain people to abuse their power with impunity. Today, you have a chance to change that. You have a chance to say that enough is enough. That we will no longer tolerate this type of behavior." Marlon, seeing the way the lawyer presented the case, felt a wave of hope. It wasn't just about his own story. It was about something much bigger. Something that could finally change the lives of so many others who went through what he went through. When Donovan's defense had its last chance to speak, the lawyer tried to argue that all the witnesses were people with motives to harm Donovan's career, but the damage was already done. The evidence, the testimonies, and especially Marlon's courage in telling his story, were too strong to be ignored. When the hearing ended, everyone anxiously awaited the jury's decision. Hours passed before the jury returned with its verdict. The room was dead silent when the judge asked the jury representative to read the decision. Marlon held his father's hand tightly, feeling that this was the moment they had fought so hard for. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mike Donovan, guilty of abuse of authority, racist conduct and violation of the civil rights of Marlon Williams and other victims." Those words exploded in the room like thunder. Marlon felt such profound relief that tears ran down his face before he could stop them. The entire hall erupted in applause and cries of justice, and Donovan, now pale and defeated, was led away by the officers. Curtis hugged his son tightly, the words were lost in the emotion of the moment. They had succeeded. Their fight had not been in vain. Donovan was being held accountable for his actions, and justice had finally been served. But the fight was not completely over. Marlon and Curtis knew this was just one victory in the midst of a larger battle, but it was a victory that marked a turning point. They had faced racism, injustice and silence, and they had won. Now, the city of Oakland, and perhaps even the country, would begin to hear more of the voices that had been silenced for so long. Mike Donovan's conviction marked a change in Oakland. The news spread across the country, igniting a flame of justice that had long been dormant. It was a case that brought hope to other communities, showing that a single young person's voice could make a difference. And Marlon became that voice. In the weeks following the trial, Marlon returned to his routine, but nothing was the same as before. At school, he was received with admiration by classmates and teachers. That boy who previously felt invisible was now seen, and his story inspired others to rise up, to not remain silent in the face of injustice. He gained a new confidence, something he had never felt before. Not just because he had won a personal battle, but because he realized that, together, he and his father, Curtis, had done something that would resonate far beyond their own lives. Curtis, in turn, had finally fulfilled his mission as a father. He knew he had taught Marlon not only about strength and resilience, but also about the power of fighting for what is right. And, in a surprising move, Curtis decided to retire from the CIA. Not out of fear or exhaustion, but to dedicate his time to the cause he now saw as his new mission in life, helping other victims of abuse and injustice. He began working with community organizations and using his intelligence experience to investigate cases of police misconduct and racism, ensuring that other stories like Marlon's were heard. For the first time in years, Curtis felt like his work made sense in a deeper, more personal way. Nina, Marlon's faithful friend, followed him on this journey of change. With her determined spirit, she became an active voice in the Oakland community, creating a group of young activists who worked to promote social change and educate about civil rights. His friendship with Marlon strengthened, and together, they began to organize lectures, events, and even peaceful protests that mobilized youth to fight for a more just society. Nina was, and would always be, Marlon's loyal friend and fighting partner. And as for Mike Donovan, his name has become associated with shame and failure. He was sentenced to a long sentence for his crimes, and his police career was completely destroyed. Behind bars, he felt the weight of every racist act, every abuse he committed. He finally had to face the reality that his actions had consequences, and that he was not above the law. Donovan experienced, for the first time, what it meant to be judged not by who he thought he was, but by what he actually did. He was forced to face a harsh truth, and the world he knew fell apart. The summer following Donovan's conviction brought a wave of renewal to Oakland. The community came together to rebuild, to heal the wounds that had been left open for so long. Marlon actively participated in this process, and he found a new purpose. He began sharing his story at schools, community events, and even online, using his voice to inspire others to face their own struggles and never give up. He understood that what happened to him was not just about a moment of pain and injustice, but about resilience and courage. And in the end, Marlon became what he always wanted to be, a symbol of strength and hope. He knew that the road would still be long, that there would still be challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had a community by his side, a family who believed in him, and a truth that no one else could silence. This story is not just about a battle won by Marlon and Curtis, but about all the battles we face every day against injustice, racism and abuse of power. How many times do we remain silent because we believe our voice will not be heard? How many times do we accept what is imposed, for fear of fighting against a system bigger than us? Marlon is living proof that change starts with a voice. A voice that refuses to be silenced, a voice that challenges injustice even when all seems lost. And the truth is that we all have that voice within us. Sometimes we just need the courage to use it, allies to fight alongside us, and the determination to keep going even when everything seems impossible. What would you do if you were in Marlon's shoes? Would you have the courage to stand up against what is wrong? Listen to your voice, listen to the call for justice that is within you, and never forget, one person can make all the difference. If you like this story and believe that these messages need to be spread, subscribe to our channel, The Tales of Twist, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any exciting and inspiring content like this. And don't forget to leave your like and share this story with whoever you think needs to hear this message. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of this journey. Together, we can inspire change and create a more just world. Until the next story.